Clean this up now or you're fired. But the owner of the house saw it and did the unexpected. Martha Higgins squeezed the cleaning spray between her trembling hands as she stared at the colorful scribbles on the hallway wall. Tears streamed down her face, while Victoria Sterling screamed just inches from her ear, threatening to fire her if she didn't clean up that mess immediately. "You're incompetent! How did you let this happen?" Victoria bellowed, pointing at the crayon drawings decorating the white hallway wall. "Clean this up right now or you're fired. No matter how many times I have to repeat it, none of you ever learn." Martha choked back her tears and began scrubbing the wall harder, even though she knew those drawings weren't the result of her carelessness. That afternoon, while taking care of the house, she had seen little Chloe, the couple's 6-year-old daughter, playing alone in the hallway. The girl was sad because her parents had fought again, and she had found a way to express her feelings through the colorful crayons. When Martha found her drawing, Chloe begged her not to tell her mother. "Please, Auntie Martha, don't tell Mommy. She'll be mad at me again," the little girl pleaded, her eyes full of tears. Now, 3 hours later, Martha was taking all the blame to protect the girl. She knew that if Victoria discovered the truth, she would take her anger out on her own daughter, as she had witnessed on other occasions. The employer had a habit of severely punishing Chloe for any mischief, keeping the child grounded for days without playing or watching TV. "You're not even listening to what I'm saying," Victoria continued, more and more worked up. 45 years old and you still can't handle a simple job. My mother already warned me that maids your age are more trouble than they're worth." The words cut deep into Martha's heart. She had worked in that house for almost 3 years, always putting her heart and soul into keeping everything spotless. She woke up at 5 in the morning every day to catch 2 buses and arrive promptly at 7. She looked after the house as if it were her own family, but Victoria never acknowledged her effort. What her employer didn't know was that Martha desperately needed that job. Her 19-year-old son, Daniel, had been diagnosed with an illness that required constant treatment. The medication cost almost half her salary, and she still supported her elderly mother, who lived with them in a small house in Flushing, Queens. "Look at what you're doing. You're spreading the paint instead of cleaning," Victoria yelled, gesturing wildly. "I should have listened to my friends from the country club when they told me to hire someone younger." Martha continued scrubbing the wall in silence, trying to ignore the humiliations. Over the years, she had learned that it was better not to fight back, even when the insults were unfair. Her mother always used to say there was no shame in honest work, and she needed to keep her dignity in order to support her family. Suddenly, a movement in the doorway caught her attention. Richard Sterling, Victoria's husband, was standing at the hallway entrance, watching the entire scene. The man, who was around 50 years old and always elegant in his well-tailored suits, had a serious expression on his face. His dark eyes seemed to analyze every word that came out of his wife's mouth. Victoria still hadn't noticed her husband's presence and continued her show of humiliation. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I don't know you did this on purpose to irritate me?" she accused, bringing her face close to Martha's. "I always knew you were worthless, from the very first day you set foot in this house." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard took a few steps into the hallway, but remained watching in silence. His presence completely changed the energy of the room, although Victoria still hadn't noticed. Martha, however, felt his eyes on the situation and grew even more nervous. "No use standing there like a statue," Victoria yelled, slamming her hand against the wall. "I told you to clean it. If you can't get that off, you're going to have to pay a painter to redo the whole thing, and you can be sure it's coming out of your paycheck." The threat made Martha's heart race. A painter would cost at least $500, money she simply didn't have. That month, Daniel needed new tests, and the health insurance didn't cover all the procedures. She had saved every penny to afford the private appointments. "Please, Mrs. Victoria, I can get it clean," Martha murmured, her voice cracking. "I just need a little more time." "More time?" Victoria laughed sarcastically. "You've already had 3 hours. How can you be this slow? My old housekeeper could get twice as much done in half the time." What Victoria failed to mention was that her old housekeeper had quit precisely because she couldn't take the mistreatment anymore. The woman had worked in the house for over 5 years, before finally finding the courage to leave. Before departing, she had even warned Martha about the boss's difficult temper, but she had no choice but to accept the job. Richard kept watching everything with growing attention. He was rarely home during the day because of his work at the accounting firm he managed, Sterling Financial Solutions, but that day he had come back early to pick up some important documents. He had never witnessed a scene like that, and the discovery of his wife's behavior was deeply unsettling him. "Do you know how much I pay for this house?" Victoria asked rhetorically. "Do you know how much it costs to maintain this standard of living? And I have to deal with incompetent employees who can't even take care of a wall." Martha tried once more to remove the scribbles, but the crayon had seeped deep into the paint. Each movement of the rag only spread the color further, creating smudges that made things even worse. Her tears dripped onto the floor as she struggled to fix something that was perhaps impossible to fix. "See? See how useless you are?" Victoria pointed, shaking her head in disapproval. "My mother-in-law was right when she said old maids are good for nothing." The mention of the mother-in-law brought a new layer of pain to Martha. Mrs. Eleanor, Richard's mother, had always been kind to her. The 72-year-old lady treated Martha with respect and warmth, always asking about her family and offering help whenever possible. It was hard to believe she had actually said those cruel words. Richard, who knew his mother very well, was certain in that moment that Victoria was lying. Mrs. Eleanor had always praised Martha's work and commented on how well the housekeeper took care of the house. That blatant lie was one more drop in the ocean of disappointment he was feeling toward his wife. "I'm going to have to call the agency that referred you," Victoria threatened, pulling her phone from her pocket. "I'm going to tell them exactly what kind of problem you caused me today. You can be sure they'll never recommend you anywhere again." The threat hit Martha like a punch to the stomach. If Victoria actually did that, it would be nearly impossible to find another job. At her age, with negative references, no family would trust her work. The prospect of being unemployed with all the bills and responsibilities she had was terrifying. "Mrs. Victoria, please don't do this," Martha pleaded, dropping the cloth and clasping her hands in supplication. "I really need this job. My son is sick, and I have nowhere else to go." "You should have thought about that before you destroyed my wall," Victoria retorted without any compassion. "Do you think I'm responsible for your problems? Everyone should mind their own business." It was at that moment that Richard finally moved. He took a few determined steps toward the two women, making enough noise to get his wife's attention. When Victoria turned and saw him, her expression changed instantly. Her face, red with anger, transformed into a forced artificial smile. "Richard! Darling!" she exclaimed, completely changing her tone of voice. "You're home early today. What a nice surprise." The transformation was so radical it was almost comical. The woman who seconds before was screaming like a madwoman now spoke with the sweet, honeyed voice of a devoted wife. Martha watched the change with a mixture of amazement and relief, hoping that her boss's presence might calm things down. "Victoria," Richard said with a controlled voice, but there was something in his tone that Martha had never heard before. "I need to talk to you. Now." "Of course, dear," she replied, still trying to keep up the facade. "I was just handling a little problem here with Martha. Nothing serious. You know how it is, right? Sometimes we need to be a bit firmer to maintain discipline." Richard looked at Martha, who kept her head down, and then observed the scribbles on the wall. His gaze swept over every detail of the scene: the dirty cloth in the maid's hands, the cleaning spray on the floor, the still fresh tears on the woman's face, and his wife's fake expression. "Martha," he said, surprising both women, "could you please go to the kitchen? I need to speak with my wife in private." The maid hesitated for a moment, looking between the couple. She didn't know if it was safe to leave them alone, or if that could make her situation even worse. Victoria, for her part, tried to decipher her husband's expression, clearly worried about what he might have heard. "Go ahead, Martha," Richard insisted, this time with kindness. "Don't worry about the wall for now." She gathered her cleaning supplies quickly and left the hallway, but she couldn't help overhearing the beginning of the conversation that followed. "Richard, darling, you don't understand," Victoria began, trying to justify her behavior. "She's very disorganized, and I need to be strict to maintain the standard of our home." "Strict?" he asked, his voice having cooled considerably. Is that what you call strict?" Victoria stammered, realizing her husband wasn't being convinced by her justifications. "How long have you been treating Martha this way?" Richard asked directly. The question caught Victoria off guard. She didn't expect to be confronted so directly about her behavior. For years, she had managed to hide her true personality from her husband, always appearing sweet and polite when he was around. "I don't mistreat anyone," she lied, trying to defend herself. "I just set clear boundaries. A home like ours needs order and discipline." Richard shook his head, clearly dissatisfied with the answer. He had heard enough of the conversation to know this wasn't an isolated incident. The cruelty in Victoria's voice, the specific humiliations she had used, all pointed to a pattern of behavior that had lasted for years. "Where's Chloe?" he asked suddenly. "She's in her room. Why?" Victoria replied, confused by the change of subject. "I'm going to talk to her," Richard announced, heading toward the bedroom hallway. "Wait," Victoria called, following him. "What do you want with her? She has nothing to do with this." But Richard was already knocking on his daughter's bedroom door. The little girl opened it with her eyes red from crying, and when she saw her father, she ran into his arms. "Daddy," Chloe sobbed. "I didn't mean to make those drawings. I promise I won't do it anymore." The child's innocent confession hit Richard like a bomb to the chest. He looked at his wife over his daughter's head and saw the despair in her eyes. Victoria knew she had been caught in her cruelest lie, allowing an innocent maid to be humiliated to protect her own image. "Chloe," said Richard, kneeling down to the girl's eye level, "you're the one who made the drawings on the wall?" "Yes," she admitted between sobs, "but Auntie Martha said she would clean it up for me. She said I didn't need to tell Mommy because she was already sad." The child's words revealed not only the truth about the drawings, but also Martha's kindness in protecting an innocent child. Richard felt a mixture of gratitude toward the maid and indignation at his wife for allowing such an injustice. "Don't worry, my princess," he said, hugging his daughter. "You didn't do anything wrong. Kids can draw, and Daddy isn't mad at you." Victoria watched the scene with growing panic. She knew her facade had completely crumbled and that she would need to find a way to get around the situation. Her mind worked frantically, searching for an excuse or justification that could save her reputation. "Richard, I can explain." She tried but was interrupted. "You don't need to explain anything right now," he said, standing up with Chloe in his arms. "First, I'm going to take care of our daughter, and then we'll talk." Richard took Chloe to the living room and turned on the TV to distract her. Then he went to the kitchen looking for Martha, who was sitting on a small chair in the corner, still dabbing her tears with a paper napkin. "Martha," he called gently. She stood up immediately, startled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richard. I was already getting ready to leave. I don't want to cause any more trouble." "You're not leaving," he said firmly. "Quite the opposite. I need to apologize on behalf of my family for what happened today." Martha looked at him in complete surprise. In all her years working as a housekeeper, she had never received an apology from an employer. Richard's attitude left her completely speechless. "I know it was Chloe who made the drawings," he continued, "and I know you took the blame to protect my daughter. That shows the kind of person you are, and I'm very grateful for that." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. Finally, someone had recognized her kindness and her sacrifice. "I couldn't let the little girl be punished," she explained, her voice trembling. "She's just a child, and she was so sad. It was no trouble for me to clean the wall." "But it cost you greatly to be humiliated unfairly," Richard observed, "and that should never have happened." They were interrupted by Victoria's arrival in the kitchen. The woman had spent the last few minutes thinking of a strategy to regain control of the situation. "Richard, darling," she began in a sweet voice, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I really thought it was Martha who had let Chloe make that mess. If I had known the truth, of course I would have been more understanding." The blatant lie deeply irritated Richard. He had clearly heard the cruelty in his wife's words, and now she was trying to rewrite the story as if it had all been an innocent mistake. "Victoria," he said with forced patience, "I heard the whole conversation. I heard the things you said to Martha. It wasn't a misunderstanding." Victoria's face turned red. She hadn't expected her husband to be so direct in the confrontation. "But darling, you know how stressed I get when the house isn't perfect," she tried one last justification. "Especially with your mother coming to visit tomorrow. I just wanted everything to be impeccable for her." The mention of his mother made Richard remember another important detail. Mrs. Eleanor had always praised Martha's work and commented on how careful and caring the housekeeper was. If his mother knew what had happened, she would be deeply disappointed in Victoria. "My mother always said that Martha is a special person," Richard commented, watching his wife's reaction. "She never said anything negative about her." Victoria realized she had been caught in yet another lie and began to panic. "Well, maybe I exaggerated a little about what your mother said," she reluctantly admitted. "But you understand, right? Sometimes people say things in the heat of the moment. Sometimes people reveal who they really are in the heat of the moment," Richard shot back. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The tension in the kitchen was palpable. Martha watched the couple's argument without knowing how to react. On one hand, she felt relieved that someone was finally defending her. On the other, she worried about the consequences this situation could bring to her job. Richard took a deep breath before continuing. "Martha, could you excuse us for a few minutes? I need to talk to my wife in private." "Of course, Mr. Richard," she replied, getting up from her chair. "I'll go check on little Chloe." After Martha left, Richard turned to Victoria with a serious expression she rarely saw. "We need to have a very frank conversation," he said. "Richard, I know you're upset, but—" "Upset?" he interrupted. "Victoria, I'm far beyond upset. I'm ashamed. Ashamed of the way you treated someone who works honestly in our house." The words struck Victoria like slaps in the face. She wasn't used to being confronted this way by her husband, who had always been patient and understanding with her moods. "You don't understand the pressure I feel," she tried to justify herself. "Keeping this house perfect, raising Chloe, dealing with all the social responsibilities we have. Sometimes I do blow up." "Blowing up is one thing," Richard replied. "Humiliating a defenseless person is something completely different. You talked about her age, her competence, threatened her job. That wasn't a moment of stress. That was deliberate cruelty." Victoria began to realize the situation was more serious than she had imagined. Her husband wasn't just annoyed. He was truly disappointed in who she had revealed herself to be. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, trying to seem remorseful. "I want you to sincerely apologize to Martha," Richard said without hesitation. "And I want this to never happen again." "Fine," Victoria agreed quickly. "I'll apologize. It was just a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Victoria," he insisted. "And if you can't recognize that, then we have a much bigger problem than I thought." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Victoria realized she had severely underestimated her husband's reaction. She'd always managed to manipulate situations in her favor, but this time she had been caught red-handed doing something he considered unforgivable. "Richard," she said, changing her strategy, "you're right. I admit I went too far. I'll apologize to Martha, and I promise I'll try to be more patient." He watched her for a long moment, trying to gauge whether her remorse was genuine or just another performance. "I hope that's true," he finally said, "because Martha is a good person, and our daughter is very fond of her. I won't allow her to be mistreated in our home." "Of course, dear," Victoria agreed, forcing a smile. "You're right. I'll be more careful from now on." But behind the forced smile, Victoria's mind was seething with anger and humiliation. She wasn't used to being contradicted or confronted, especially by her own husband. In her distorted perspective, the whole situation was Martha's fault for having caused the initial problem. Richard left the kitchen to fetch Martha, who was in the living room playing with dolls with Chloe. The sight of the two of them together, the maid patiently entertaining his daughter after having been so mistreated, touched his heart deeply. "Martha," he called softly, "could you come here, please?" She stood up immediately, leaving Chloe with her dolls. "Yes, Mr. Richard." "First of all, he said when they returned to the kitchen where Victoria was waiting for them. "I'd like to apologize personally for what happened today. What my wife did was completely unacceptable." Martha glanced quickly at Victoria, who maintained a neutral expression, clearly forced. "You don't need to worry, Mr. Richard," she murmured. "I understand that sometimes situations get stressful." "No," he said firmly. "There's no excuse for treating someone the way you were treated, and I want you to know that this doesn't represent our family's values." Victoria remained silent, watching the interaction. Every word of praise and acknowledgement Richard directed at the maid increased her irritation. "Martha," Richard continued, "my wife has something to say to you." All eyes turned to Victoria, who hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Martha," she began in a mechanical voice, "I apologize for the misunderstanding today. I recognize that I expressed myself inappropriately." The apology sounded forced and insincere, but Martha accepted it gracefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Victoria. I accept your apology." Richard noticed the lack of sincerity in his wife's voice, but decided not to prolong the awkwardness of the moment. "Very well," he said. "Now, about the wall. Martha, don't worry about it. I'll hire someone to repaint it tomorrow." "That's not necessary, Mr. Richard," she protested. "I can try to clean it a bit more." "Absolutely not," he insisted. "It was my daughter who made the drawings, so it's my responsibility to fix it. Besides, I think she can keep drawing on paper like all children do." Richard's kindness contrasted drastically with the treatment Martha had received from Victoria. She felt so relieved that she had to hold back tears again. "Mr. Richard," she said with a choked voice, "thank you so much for understanding. I really needed this job." "And you'll keep having it," he assured her. "Please don't worry about that." Victoria watched the entire interaction with growing irritation. In her distorted mind, Richard was giving too much importance to a simple housekeeper. She began plotting ways to regain control of the situation and show her husband that that woman didn't deserve so much consideration. "Well," Victoria said with false cheerfulness, "since everything is cleared up, how about we get back to our normal activities? Martha, you can continue with your usual chores." The suggestion of returning to normalcy seemed reasonable, but Richard was still processing everything he had discovered about his wife. The image he had of Victoria as a polished, refined person had been shattered in a matter of minutes. "Of course," he agreed, but his voice still carried an unusual coldness. "Martha, feel free to do your work as you always have. If you need anything, you can come to me." "Thank you, Mr. Richard," she said, genuinely grateful for the protection she had received. As Martha headed to other parts of the house to continue her chores, Richard and Victoria were left alone in the kitchen once again. The mood between them had shifted drastically, and both knew that this conversation was far from over. "Richard," Victoria tried, approaching him with affectionate gestures, "thank you for helping me resolve this situation. You always manage to bring peace to our home." He watched her with critical eyes, not letting himself be swayed by her false displays of affection. "Victoria, we need to have a serious talk about this," he said, pulling back slightly. "What I witnessed today worries me a great deal." "Why, darling?" she asked, pretending not to understand. "We've already apologized. We've already resolved everything." "Because it makes me question how many other things I don't know about you," he replied with brutal honesty. The answer caught Victoria off guard. She hadn't expected a simple argument with the maid to shake the very foundations of her marriage. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to appear offended. "You've known me for over 10 years. "I thought I did," said Richard, shaking his head. "But the woman I saw today treating Martha that way is not the woman I married." Richard's words hit Victoria like a bucket of cold water. For the first time, she realized that her actions could have much more serious consequences than she had imagined. "Richard, you're exaggerating." She tried to downplay it. "It was just a moment of stress. Everyone has bad days." "Bad days don't justify humiliating other people," he countered. "And what worries me most is that you looked very comfortable doing it, as if it were something normal for you." The accusation was too precise for Victoria to deny completely. In truth, she had become so accustomed to treating maids that way that she no longer even noticed the cruelty of her words. I sometimes get nervous when things don't go as planned," she admitted reluctantly. "But it was never my intention to be cruel." "Intention or not, that's what happened," said Richard, "and it needs to stop." The final tone of his voice made it clear that this was not a request, but a demand. Victoria realized that she had lost much of the power she used to wield over her husband. "Fine," she agreed, knowing she had no other choice at the moment. "I'll make an effort to be more patient." "I hope so," said Richard, but his voice still carried doubts about her sincerity. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, Martha tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind was too restless to function normally. What had happened that day stirred her emotions deeply and made her question many things about her life. On one hand, she felt profoundly grateful for Richard's intervention. She had never had an employer defend her so firmly. On the other hand, she feared the situation could worsen in the coming days, when Richard wouldn't be home to protect her. She knew Victoria's temper well, and knew that the woman didn't usually forget when she felt humiliated. The likelihood that she would take her anger out on Martha when they were alone was very high, but even with all those fears, Martha felt something different in her chest. For the first time in a long while, someone had acknowledged her dignity as a human being. Richard had treated her with respect and had defended her rights as an employee and as a person. That experience made her think about her own self-worth and about how she had grown accustomed to accepting humiliation as a normal part of her life. Perhaps it was time to start valuing herself more and demanding the respectful treatment she deserved. As she folded clothes in the master bedroom, Martha could hear fragments of the conversation that Richard and Victoria were still having in the kitchen. Their voices were lower now, but the tone was still serious. She tried not to pay attention, focusing on her work, but she couldn't help overhearing when Richard mentioned something about family values and setting an example for their daughter. Those words made her smile slightly, as they showed he genuinely cared about the kind of environment Chloe was growing up in. Little Chloe had always been affectionate with Martha. The girl often sought her out to talk about her toys, her favorite cartoons, or simply to get a hug when she was sad. That bond of genuine affection was one of the most rewarding parts of Martha's job. Thinking about the child, Martha remembered how distressed Chloe had been when her parents argued that morning. The girl had opened up to her about how she didn't like it when her parents yelled at each other and how it made her scared. "Auntie Martha," Chloe had said with her big, worried eyes, "why do Mommy and Daddy always get so angry?" Martha had comforted the child as best she could, explaining that sometimes adults got stressed and argued, but that it didn't mean they didn't love each other or that they didn't love her. Now, reflecting on that conversation, Martha realized that Chloe was growing up in a far more turbulent environment than any child should have to experience. The constant tension between her parents, combined with Victoria's explosive temper, was clearly affecting the girl's emotional well-being. This concern for Chloe added a new dimension to Martha's conflicting feelings about the whole situation. Even if she managed to keep her job and find a way to deal with Victoria, she wondered whether it would be right to keep working in a house where she witnessed daily situations that could be harmful to a child. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The days that followed the incident brought a strange atmosphere to the Sterling household. Richard had resumed his normal work routine, but he kept carefully observing any interaction between Victoria and Martha. Victoria, for her part, tried to keep up appearances, being artificially polite to the housekeeper whenever her husband was around. However, when Richard left for work, the tension between the two women was palpable. Victoria had not forgotten the humiliation of being confronted by her husband, and Martha could feel the veiled hostility in every look and sharp remark she received. "Martha," Victoria would say in a sweet voice, but with cold eyes, "be careful not to break this china. It's very expensive, and it would be terrible if something happened to it." The indirect threats and sarcastic comments became Victoria's new way of exerting her power. She had learned to be more subtle in her cruelty, avoiding the explosive outbursts that might draw her husband's attention again. Martha perfectly understood the psychological game being played, but she tried to stay focused on her work and her need to keep her job. Every day was an exercise in patience and self-control, swallowing smaller humiliations to avoid bigger confrontations. The situation became even more complicated when Mrs. Eleanor, Richard's mother, came to stay for a few days. The 72-year-old woman, always elegant and sharp, was quick to notice that something was different in the household atmosphere. "Martha, dear," Mrs. Eleanor said during breakfast, after Victoria had gone out shopping, "you seem tense. Is everything all right?" The caring question almost made Martha burst into tears. Mrs. Eleanor's kindness contrasted tremendously with the cold treatment she had been receiving from Victoria. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Eleanor," Martha lied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." But Mrs. Eleanor wasn't easily fooled. Her years of experience had taught her to read people in situations with remarkable precision. "Has my daughter-in-law been treating you well?" she asked directly, watching Martha's reaction closely. The question caught Martha off guard. She didn't know how to answer without seeming like she was gossiping or causing problems for the family. "Mrs. Victoria is demanding," she said carefully, "but that's normal. She wants everything to be perfect." Mrs. Eleanor nodded slowly, but her experienced eyes caught much more than Martha's cautious words revealed. "Demanding is one thing," the lady commented. "Disrespectful is another. I hope you know the difference and don't accept anything that goes beyond the professional." Mrs. Eleanor's words brought tears to Martha's eyes. It was comforting to know that at least someone in the family cared about her well-being as a person. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor," she said with a choked voice. "Your words mean so much to me." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, who was returning from shopping with an annoyed expression on her face. "Mother," she said to Mrs. Eleanor with a forced smile, "you shouldn't be talking so long with Martha. She has a lot of work to do." "Martha is part of this family," Mrs. Eleanor replied firmly, "and I talk to whoever I want, whenever I want." The mother-in-law's response left Victoria visibly uncomfortable, but she couldn't openly argue with her husband's mother. "Of course, Mother," she said through gritted teeth. "It was just a suggestion." Mrs. Eleanor watched the interaction with growing interest. The tension between Victoria and Martha was too obvious to go unnoticed, and she began to suspect there was something much more serious happening in that house. During lunch, when Richard arrived from work, Mrs. Eleanor decided to investigate a little more. "Richard, dear," she said casually, "how have you all been treating Martha? She seems a bit down lately." The question made Richard choke slightly on his food. He quickly looked at Victoria, who had gone rigid in her chair. "Why do you ask, Mother?" he questioned, trying to keep his tone casual. "Just an old woman's curiosity," Mrs. Eleanor replied with a shrewd smile. "You know how I worry about the people who work for our family." Victoria forced a laugh. "Mother, you worry too much. Martha is fine. We treat her very well." "Of course we do," Richard agreed, but there was something in his tone that didn't completely convince his mother. Mrs. Eleanor decided not to press the matter for the moment, but mentally noted that she would need to observe the household dynamics more closely during her stay. Her opportunity came the next day when Richard left early for an important meeting and Victoria went to the beauty salon. Mrs. Eleanor was left home alone with Martha and Chloe and decided to use that time to discover the truth. "Chloe, dear," she said to her granddaughter, who was playing in the living room, "come here and talk to Grandma." The little girl ran into her grandmother's arms, always happy to receive attention. "Grandma, are you going to stay here long?" Chloe asked with bright eyes. "A few days, my princess," Mrs. Eleanor replied, stroking the child's hair. "Tell Grandma, how have you been feeling lately?" "Good," Chloe said, but her expression turned a little sad. "Sometimes Mommy and Daddy fight, and I get scared." "And Auntie Martha? Has she been affectionate with you?" "Yes," Chloe exclaimed, brightening up. "Auntie Martha is really nice. She plays with me and gives me hugs when I'm sad. But sometimes Mommy yells at her." The innocent revelation from the child confirmed Mrs. Eleanor's suspicions. "Mommy yells at Auntie Martha? Why?" "I don't know," said Chloe, shrugging. "Mommy yells at a lot of people when she's angry." Mrs. Eleanor hugged her granddaughter tighter, realizing the situation was even more serious than she had imagined. Chloe, can you get Auntie Martha for me?" The girl ran off to fetch Martha, who appeared in the living room drying her hands on a dish towel. "Yes, Mrs. Eleanor?" "Come sit here with me, dear," said the older woman, patting the spot on the sofa beside her. "I want to talk to you about something important." Martha sat down hesitantly, not knowing what to expect. "Martha," began Mrs. Eleanor gently, "you know I've always been very fond of you. From the very first day you started working here, I could tell you were someone special." "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor," Martha murmured, touched by the words. "That's why I worry when I see that something isn't right with you," the older woman continued, "and I know something isn't right." Martha looked down, fighting back the tears that always came whenever someone showed genuine concern for her. "I want you to tell me the truth about what has been happening in this house," said Mrs. Eleanor with maternal firmness, "and don't worry about the consequences. I'll protect you." The promise of protection was too much for Martha to bear. Tears began to fall as she struggled to find the right words. "Mrs. Eleanor," she managed to say between sobs, "I don't want to cause trouble for the family." "You're not causing trouble," the older woman assured her. "The trouble already exists. I just want to understand what the real situation is." Slowly, Martha began to tell of years of humiliations, of constant insults, of the ever-present fear of losing her job. She spoke about the incident with the drawings on the wall and how Richard had intervened. Mrs. Eleanor listened to everything in silence, her expression growing more and more serious as Martha revealed the details of the treatment she received from Victoria. "My God," Mrs. Eleanor murmured when Martha finished. "I had no idea the situation was so serious." "Please, Mrs. Eleanor," Martha pleaded, "don't tell anyone. I really need this job. My son is sick, and I have nowhere else to go." "Dear," said Mrs. Eleanor, taking Martha's hands in hers, "you can't keep living like this. No one deserves to be treated that way." "But what can I do?" Martha asked desperately. "At my age, with my limited education, who's going to give me another job?" The question touched Mrs. Eleanor's heart, and she saw in Martha's vulnerability the reflection of so many other women in similar situations. "First," she said with determination, "you need to know that you're not alone. Second, my son needs to know exactly what has been happening here." "No, please," Martha protested. "Mr. Richard has already done so much for me. I don't want to cause more problems in his marriage." "Martha," said Mrs. Eleanor patiently, "the problem isn't you, the problem is my daughter-in-law's behavior. And if my son doesn't know the whole truth, he can't make the right decisions." The logic of Mrs. Eleanor's argument was undeniable, but Martha still hesitated. Her life experience had taught her that poor people like her rarely came out on top when they got involved in the family conflicts of wealthy people. "I understand your fear," said Mrs. Eleanor, noticing the hesitation, "but sometimes we have to be brave enough to do what's right, even when it's frightening." The conversation was interrupted by Victoria's arrival, returning from the salon with freshly styled hair and a suspicious look on her face at seeing the two women talking intimately on the sofa. "Mother," she said with feigned cheerfulness, "I see you two were having an interesting conversation." "We certainly were," replied Mrs. Eleanor, unflinching. "Martha is a very pleasant companion." Victoria forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her irritation. "Martha," she said in a controlled voice, "I believe you have work to do in the kitchen." "She can finish our conversation first," Mrs. Eleanor interjected before Martha could get up. Her mother-in-law's intervention left Victoria visibly uncomfortable, but she couldn't openly question the authority of Richard's mother. "Of course," she said through gritted teeth, "I just don't want her falling behind on her duties." Mrs. Eleanor watched her daughter-in-law with a critical eye, noticing the poorly veiled, threatening tone in her words. "Victoria," she said calmly, "you seem tense. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mother," Victoria lied. "Just concerned about dinner tonight. You know how much I want everything to be perfect." "I'm sure Martha will do an excellent job, as always," remarked Mrs. Eleanor, watching her daughter-in-law's reaction. The praise for the housekeeper clearly irritated Victoria, who struggled to maintain her composure. "Yes, of course," she agreed reluctantly. Mrs. Eleanor decided she had seen enough for now. The dynamic between Victoria and Martha was unfolding exactly as the housekeeper had described, and she began to formulate a plan to protect the woman who had become so important to her family. "Martha," she said, rising from the sofa, "thank you for the conversation. It was very enlightening." Martha understood the unspoken message and nodded discreetly before heading to the kitchen. Mrs. Eleanor was left alone with Victoria in the living room and decided to run a test. "Victoria," she said casually, "Martha seems like a person very devoted to the family." "Yes," Victoria agreed hesitantly. "She's suitable for our needs." The careful choice of words did not go unnoticed by Mrs. Eleanor. "Suitable?" she repeated. "I thought you'd consider her more than that, given how long she's worked here." Victoria realized she was being tested, but didn't know exactly what answer her mother-in-law expected to hear. "Well, of course we appreciate her work," she said cautiously. "It's just that, it's important to maintain professional boundaries." "Professional boundaries are important," Mrs. Eleanor agreed, "but respectful treatment is fundamental in any relationship, professional or not." The remark was made in a neutral tone, but Victoria felt the weight of the implied criticism. "Of course, Mother," she said, trying to end the matter. "I always treat everyone with respect." Mrs. Eleanor nodded silently, but her experienced eyes told a different story. She had seen enough to confirm her suspicions and now needed to decide how to proceed. Dinner that night was a tense experience for everyone involved. Richard immediately noticed that something had changed in the atmosphere of the house, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Mrs. Eleanor watched Victoria closely, noticing how her daughter-in-law treated Martha as she served the table. Although there were no direct insults, there was a calculated coldness in every interaction, a subtle way of belittling and humiliating that was almost worse than direct attacks. "Martha," Victoria said when the housekeeper brought the main course, "could you be more careful? You almost spilled sauce on the table." Mrs. Eleanor watched closely and saw that Martha had been perfectly careful, yet accepted the unfair criticism in silence. "I didn't see any problem," Mrs. Eleanor commented softly. "Ah, perhaps I was mistaken," Victoria said quickly, realizing she had been caught in a lie. Richard, who was paying attention to the conversation, began to notice patterns he had missed before. The way Victoria always found fault with Martha's work, even when everything was perfect. The way the maid flinched slightly whenever his wife spoke. "Mother," he said suddenly, "you seem worried about something." Mrs. Eleanor looked at her son, carefully weighing her next words. "Just observing the family dynamics," she replied diplomatically. "It's interesting how people behave in different situations." The enigmatic answer left both Richard and Victoria slightly uncomfortable, each for different reasons. After dinner, when Martha was washing the dishes in the kitchen, Mrs. Eleanor asked to speak privately with Richard. They headed to the study, away from curious ears. "Richard," his mother began without preamble, "we need to talk about a very serious situation." "What is it about, Mother?" "About the way your wife has been treating Martha." Richard felt his stomach tighten. Since the incident with the drawings on the wall, he had been monitoring the interactions between Victoria and Martha, but he hadn't witnessed any other explicit episode of abuse. "Mother, I know there was a misunderstanding a few days ago, but we resolved it." "Son," said Mrs. Eleanor patiently, "that wasn't a misunderstanding. It's been a pattern of behavior that has been going on for years." The statement shocked Richard. "What do you mean for years?" Mrs. Eleanor told her son everything she had discovered during her conversation with Martha. She described the constant humiliations, the insults about age and competence, the threats of termination, and the atmosphere of fear in which the maid lived daily. Richard listened to everything in growing silence, his face becoming increasingly serious as his mother revealed the extent of the problem. "My God," he murmured when Mrs. Eleanor finished. "I didn't know it was that serious." "How could you know?" his mother asked. Victoria has always been careful to hide this behavior when you're present." "But why did Martha never tell me?" "Because she's afraid," explained Mrs. Eleanor. "Afraid of losing her job, afraid of not finding another one, afraid of not being able to pay for her son's treatment. People in vulnerable situations like hers rarely have the courage to report abuse." Richard ran his hands over his face, trying to process all the information. "What do I do now, Mother?" "You need to make a decision about what kind of man and father you want to be," said Mrs. Eleanor seriously, "and what kind of example you want to set for your daughter." The mention of Chloe brought a new dimension of concern to Richard. "Do you think this is affecting Chloe? Son, a child who grows up seeing someone treated as inferior develops very dangerous concepts about respect and human dignity. Either she learns that it's normal to treat people in vulnerable positions poorly, or she learns that it's normal to accept mistreatment." His mother's analysis hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He had never considered the impact that situation could have on his daughter's moral development. "Besides," continued Mrs. Eleanor, "Martha truly loves Chloe. She protects your daughter even when it results in punishment for herself. A person like that doesn't deserve to be treated with cruelty." Richard remembered the incident with the drawings on the wall and how Martha had taken the blame to protect Chloe. The nobility of that gesture contrasted horribly with the cruelty of his wife. "I'll talk to Victoria," he said finally. "Richard," said his mother, placing her hand on his arm, "talking may not be enough. Some people change when they're confronted, but others just become more skilled at hiding their behavior. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you need to be prepared to take more drastic measures if necessary," said Mrs. Eleanor. "Martha is a good person who doesn't deserve to live in fear. And your daughter deserves to grow up in an environment where all people are treated with dignity." The conversation with his mother left Richard deeply troubled. He had always prided himself on being a fair and righteous man, but now he discovered that he had allowed terrible injustices to happen right under his nose. That night, he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide how to proceed. Victoria slept beside him, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. By morning, Richard had made his decision. He waited for Victoria to wake up and asked to speak with her before she got out of bed. "Victoria," he said with a serious tone, "my mother told me some things about your behavior toward Martha." Victoria's face went pale instantly. "What did she say?" "She told me about years of humiliation, insults and threats. She told me about how you treat Martha when I'm not around." Victoria sat up in bed, her mind working frantically to find a defense. "Richard, your mother doesn't understand how hard it is to manage a household. Sometimes you have to be firm with the staff." "Firm?" asked Richard, his voice rising. "Calling someone incompetent because of their age is being firm? Threatening someone's job over minor mistakes is being firm?" "I never—" Victoria began, but Richard cut her off. "Don't lie to me, Victoria, not now. I know the truth." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Victoria realized her options were running out quickly. "Richard, I can change," she said desperately. "If you think I overdid it, I can be more patient." "This isn't about overdoing it," said Richard, getting up from the bed. "This is about character, and what you've done reveals a lot about who you really are." The words hit Victoria like slaps in the face. She had never seen her husband so disappointed and determined. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to appear vulnerable. "I want you to sincerely apologize to Martha for years of mistreatment. I want you to guarantee this will never happen again, and I want you to understand that I'll be watching very closely from now on." "And what if I can't change?" asked Victoria, fearing the answer. Richard looked her in the eyes with a seriousness she had never seen before. "Then we're going to have to reevaluate this marriage, because I'm not going to raise my daughter in an environment where people are treated as inferior." The threat was delivered calmly, but its impact was devastating. Victoria realized she had completely underestimated the consequences of her actions. "Richard, you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," he confirmed. "Martha is a good person who has taken care of our family with dedication. If you can't treat her with the basic respect any human being deserves, then we have much bigger problems than I imagined." Victoria fell silent, processing the ultimatum she had received. For the first time in her life, she was facing real consequences for her cruel behavior. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll apologize to her. I'll try to be better." "Don't try," Richard said firmly. "Be." With those words, he left the bedroom, leaving Victoria alone with the weight of her actions and the reality that her life was about to change drastically. Richard found his mother in the kitchen, having coffee with Martha. The sight of the two women chatting amiably made him smile for the first time in days. "Good morning," he said, joining them. "Good morning, Mr. Richard," Martha replied, standing up immediately. "Please sit down," he said gently. "Actually, I wanted to talk to both of you." Mrs. Eleanor and Martha exchanged uncertain glances. "First," began Richard, "I want to apologize, Martha, for not realizing sooner what was happening in this house." "Mr. Richard, you don't need to," she began, but he interrupted her. "Yes, I do. This is my house, my family, my responsibility, and I failed to protect you." Tears welled up in Martha's eyes. She had never received such a sincere and respectful apology. "Second," continued Richard, "I want you to know that this will never happen again. I promise." "Thank you, Mr. Richard," she murmured, moved. "And third," he said with a smile, "I'd like to offer you something." Martha looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I'm opening a new branch of Sterling Financial Solutions, and I need someone to take care of the office. It's not heavy cleaning work. It would be more about organization, reception, and serving coffee to clients. The salary would be better, and you'd have all your employment rights." The offer left Martha completely speechless. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "You don't have to answer now," said Richard. "Think it over. But I want you to know it's a sincere offer." "Richard," said Mrs. Eleanor proudly, "you're doing the right thing." "I learned from the best," he replied, smiling at his mother. At that moment Victoria appeared in the kitchen, dressed and put together, but with a hesitant expression on her face. "Good morning," she said, her voice sounding strange. "Good morning, Victoria," replied Richard, watching her closely. Victoria looked at Martha, who was still processing the offer she had just received. "Martha," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'd like to speak with you." Everyone in the kitchen fell silent, waiting. "I want to apologize," continued Victoria, the words coming out with difficulty, "for my behavior, for how I treated you all these years." Martha looked at her in total surprise. "I know it wasn't right," Victoria went on, struggling with every word, "and I'm going to try to be a better person." The apology, although clearly forced, still represented a public acknowledgement of guilt that Martha had never expected to receive. "Thank you, Mrs. Victoria," she said simply. Richard observed the entire interaction carefully, noting both his wife's limited sincerity and Martha's grace in accepting the apology. "Well," said Mrs. Eleanor, breaking the silence, "how about we have our coffee in peace?" But lasting peace was still far away. In the days that followed, it became clear that Victoria's change was superficial and motivated only by fear of the consequences. Although she didn't revert to direct attacks, her hostility manifested itself in more subtle and psychologically destructive ways. She began to constantly question Martha's work, finding non-existent flaws and creating unnecessary tasks. She made sarcastic comments about the new job opportunity that Richard had offered, trying to undermine Martha's confidence. "Are you sure you're ready to work in an office?" she would ask with feigned concern. "It's very different from cleaning houses." Victoria's psychological campaign was working. Martha began to question whether she truly would be capable of performing different duties than those she had always carried out. Her self-esteem, already fragile from years of humiliation, began to waver again. It was Mrs. Eleanor who first noticed what was happening. "Martha," she said during one of their conversations in the kitchen, "you seem worried about Richard's offer." "It's just, maybe Mrs. Victoria is right," confessed Martha. "Maybe I'm not smart enough to work in an office." "Martha," said Mrs. Eleanor firmly, "you're one of the most intelligent people I know. Intelligence isn't measured only by formal education. But what if I do something wrong? And what if the clients don't like me?" Mrs. Eleanor noticed that Victoria had managed to plant seeds of doubt in Martha's mind, psychologically sabotaging the opportunity Richard had offered. "Dear," she said, taking Martha's hands, You've taken care of this house and this family with more competence and dedication than many executives run their companies. You have all the skills you need." The conversation was interrupted by Chloe's arrival, who ran to hug them both. "Grandma! Auntie Martha!" the girl exclaimed. "What are you two talking about?" "We're talking about how special Auntie Martha is," said Mrs. Eleanor, hugging her granddaughter. "I know," Chloe agreed happily. "Auntie Martha is the best. She takes care of me when I'm sad and makes the best brigadeiro in the world." The child's innocence brought tears to Martha's eyes. Chloe's genuine affection was one of the most rewarding aspects of her job, and the thought of leaving the girl made her deeply sad. "Chloe," said Mrs. Eleanor, "how would you feel about Auntie Martha working at your dad's office?" "That would be great," the girl replied without hesitation. "But she's still going to come visit us, right?" "Of course I will, sweetheart," Martha assured her, touched by the child's concern. The conversation with Chloe helped Martha realize that her relationship with the family went far beyond her duties as a housekeeper. She had truly become part of those people's lives, at least the ones who really mattered. That evening, when Richard came home from work, Mrs. Eleanor asked to speak with him again. "Victoria is sabotaging Martha," she said bluntly. "What do you mean?" "She's undermining her confidence about the job offer, making her feel incapable and inadequate." Richard sighed deeply. He had hoped his serious conversation with Victoria would bring real change, but apparently it had only forced his wife to be more creative in her cruelty. "What do I do, Mom?" "You need to make a final decision about your marriage," said Mrs. Eleanor. "People like Victoria rarely truly change. They just adapt to avoid consequences." The truth in his mother's words was undeniable. Richard had spent the past few days watching Victoria closely, and although she hadn't returned to direct attacks, he could see the subtle, constant manipulation she exercised over Martha. "I know it's a difficult decision," Mrs. Eleanor continued, "but you need to think about what's best for Chloe and for the people who depend on you. Do you think I should get a divorce?" "I think you should seriously consider that possibility," his mother replied. "A marriage based on coexisting with cruelty is not a good example for your daughter." Richard knew his mother was right, but the prospect of dismantling his family still terrified him. He had always believed that marriage was for life, and the idea of failing that commitment deeply unsettled him. "Besides," Mrs. Eleanor added, "you need to consider what your inaction communicates to Martha and to people in similar situations. If you don't take a firm stand against cruelty, you're implicitly approving it." The moral weight of the issue struck Richard deeply. He realized his decision had implications far beyond his personal life. That very night, Richard confronted Victoria once more. "I know what you're doing to Martha," he said directly. "What are you talking about?" she asked, trying to appear innocent. "You're trying to make her feel incapable of accepting the job offer. You're psychologically sabotaging an opportunity that could change her life." Victoria realized she had been found out again. "I just think she should be realistic about her limitations," she defended herself. "Martha's only limitations are the ones you try to impose on her," Richard shot back. "And that ends now." "Or what?" Victoria challenged, tired of being constantly confronted. "Or I'll file for divorce," Richard said with deadly calm. The threat, this time made with complete seriousness, left Victoria in shock. "You wouldn't do that?" "Yes, I would," he confirmed, "and you know I would." The silence that followed was charged with a different kind of tension. Victoria realized she had finally pushed her husband past his limit of tolerance. "Richard," she said, her voice losing all of its former arrogance, "we can work this out." "No, Victoria, we can't, because you don't actually want to change. You just want to avoid the consequences of your actions." The accusation was too precise to be denied. "I'm starting divorce proceedings tomorrow," Richard announced, "and I'm going to ask for custody of Chloe." "You can't do this to me," Victoria shouted, finally losing her composure. "Yes, I can, and I will." The determination in Richard's voice convinced Victoria that he wasn't bluffing. For the first time in her life, she was facing real and irreversible consequences for her behavior. "Richard, please," she pleaded, trying one last manipulative card. "Think about our family. Think about Chloe." "I am thinking about Chloe," he replied. "That's exactly why I'm doing this." I don't want my daughter to learn that it's normal to treat people badly." With those words, Richard left the room, leaving Victoria alone with the weight of her choices. The next morning, Richard found Martha in the kitchen, where she was preparing breakfast with Chloe's help. "Martha," he said, "have you given any more thought to my offer?" "I'm still thinking about it, Mr. Richard," she replied hesitantly. "May I ask what's making you hesitate?" Martha looked at Chloe, who was playing happily beside them, and then at Richard. "It's just, I've never worked in an office. I'm afraid I won't know how to do things right." Richard immediately recognized the influence of Victoria's words on Martha's insecurity. "Martha," he said gently, "do you think I would offer a job to someone who wasn't capable?" The question made her pause for a moment. "No, but—" "There's no but," he interrupted. "I've known you for 3 years. I've seen your dedication, your responsibility, your ability to solve problems. You have every quality I look for in an employee. But what if the clients don't like me? The clients will love you," Richard assured her, "because you treat people with respect and kindness. That matters more than any technical skill." Chloe, who had been listening to the conversation, decided to join in. "Auntie Martha," she said, "you're so smart. You teach me how to do math, and you always know how to fix my toys when they break." The child's innocent observation made Martha smile for the first time in days. "See," Richard said, "even Chloe recognizes your qualities. Besides," added Mrs. Eleanor, who had just arrived in the kitchen, "you'll receive proper training before you start. No one expects you to know everything right away." The family's combined support began to restore Martha's confidence. She realized that the doubts she had been feeling weren't based on real limitations, but on the psychological manipulation she had suffered. "All right," she said finally. "I accept." "Excellent," Richard exclaimed. "We'll start next Monday. That gives you a week to prepare." The joy on Chloe's face was contagious. "Auntie Martha is going to have a new job," the girl shouted, clapping her hands. Even in the midst of her happiness, Martha felt a pang of sadness about leaving the house where she had worked for so long. Despite all the problems with Victoria, that place had become familiar, and Chloe was like a daughter to her. "Chloe," she said, kneeling down to the child's level, "even working at your dad's office, I'll always be your Auntie Martha." "Promise?" the little girl asked with bright eyes. "I promise." The hug that followed between the two was watched warmly by Richard and Mrs. Eleanor, who recognized something truly special in their relationship. Martha's decision to accept the new position marked a turning point not only in her life, but in the dynamics of the whole family. When Victoria heard the news, she was furious, but she could no longer openly express her anger. "I hope you don't regret it," she said, with thinly veiled sarcasm when Martha told her about the decision. "I'm sure I won't," Martha replied with a confidence that surprised even herself. The maid's firm response caught Victoria off guard. For the first time, Martha had stood up to one of her provocations instead of passively accepting it. "We'll see," said Victoria, storming out of the kitchen. Mrs. Eleanor, who had witnessed the exchange, smiled with pride. "Well done, Martha. You're learning to value yourself." "I think I am," Martha agreed, surprised by her own courage. The week that followed was one of the most transformative in Martha's life. Richard arranged her training for the new job, introducing her to the basics of reception and office organization. To her surprise, she discovered she had a natural talent for dealing with clients and organizing information. "You're a treasure," said George, the senior accountant at Sterling Financial Solutions, after watching her efficiently reorganize a file that had been a mess for months. "Richard was lucky to find you." Professional recognition was a completely new experience for Martha. For the first time in her life, her intelligence and competence were being valued in a work environment. Meanwhile, at home, the tension between Richard and Victoria continued to escalate. The divorce proceedings had officially begun, and Victoria was discovering that her influence over her husband had drastically diminished. "You're really going to destroy our family because of a maid?" she asked during one of their arguments. "I'm not destroying our family because of Martha," Richard replied calmly. "I'm protecting my daughter from growing up in a toxic environment." Richard's shift in perspective was radical and irreversible. He had spent years adapting to Victoria's moods and cruelties, but the situation with Martha had opened his eyes to patterns of behavior he could no longer tolerate. "Think about Chloe," Victoria pleaded, trying to use her daughter as emotional leverage. "That's exactly what I'm doing," he said. "I want her to grow up knowing that all people deserve to be treated with dignity." Richard's moral argument was irrefutable, and Victoria knew it. Her carefully constructed life was crumbling, and she felt powerless to stop the process. Mrs. Eleanor, watching the whole situation unfold, felt proud of the courage her son was showing. It wasn't easy to end a marriage, especially with a child involved, but Richard was prioritizing the right values over social convenience. "You're doing the right thing," she told her son during one of their private conversations. "I hope so, Mom. Sometimes I feel guilty for putting Chloe through all of this." "Chloe will be happier growing up in an honest and respectful environment," Mrs. Eleanor assured him. "Children always pick up on tension and insincerity in the family." The wisdom of his mother's words brought relief to Richard. He had noticed how Chloe seemed more relaxed and happier since the constant atmosphere of hostility had eased at home. Martha's first day at her new job was a mix of nervousness and excitement. Richard accompanied her to the office and introduced her to the entire team. "This is Martha Higgins," he said during the morning meeting. "She will be our new receptionist and administrative assistant. I'm sure you'll all love working with her." The warm reception from her co-workers was a pleasant surprise for Martha. She had prepared herself to face prejudice because of her age and lack of office experience, but instead she found a supportive and encouraging environment. "If you need anything, just ask," said Sarah, the junior accountant. "We've all been through the adjustment phase." The kindness of her new colleagues contrasted dramatically with the treatment Martha had received from Victoria over the years. For the first time, she was in an environment where her contributions were valued and where she was treated as an equal. During lunch, Richard stopped by the office to see how she was settling in. "How was your first morning?" he asked. "Much better than I expected," Martha replied with a genuine smile. "Everyone is very kind." "I told you you'd do well," Richard reminded her. "How are you feeling?" "Different," she said, thinking carefully about her answer. "For the first time in my life, I feel like my opinions matter." The observation touched Richard deeply as he realized how years of humiliation had affected Martha's self-esteem. "Your opinions always mattered," he said. "They were just being ignored by people who failed to recognize your worth." The sincere acknowledgement of the respect she had always deserved brought tears to Martha's eyes. "Mr. Richard," she said with a choked voice, "I will never forget what you've done for me." "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "I deserved this opportunity a long time ago." Meanwhile, at the Sterling household, Victoria was dealing with the new reality of having to handle on her own many of the tasks that Martha had always taken care of. Without the housekeeper to take out her frustrations on, she felt even more irritated and out of place. Chloe, for her part, missed Martha's constant presence but was excited about the visits she made to her father's office after school. "Auntie Martha!" the girl would shout every time she arrived at Richard's office. "How was your workday?" Chloe's joy at seeing her in her new professional environment filled Martha's heart with satisfaction. The child was proud of her, and that meant more than any professional recognition. "It was great, Princess," Martha would reply, hugging the girl. "And how was school today?" Their conversations remained special, but they now took place in a different context, where Martha was seen as a respected professional instead of just a housekeeper. As the days went by, it became increasingly clear that the change had been beneficial for everyone involved. Martha flourished in her new work environment, discovering skills and talents she had never had the chance to explore. Richard felt proud for having made the right decision, and Chloe continued to enjoy the presence of her dear Auntie Martha, now under much more positive circumstances. The only person who wasn't benefiting from the change was Victoria, who found herself increasingly isolated and confronted with the consequences of years of cruel behavior. Her social life began to suffer as news of the divorce spread among her circles, especially once the reasons became known. "Is it true that you mistreated your housekeeper?" asked Kimberly, one of her friends from the country club, during a tea gathering. "Of course not," Victoria lied, Richard is exaggerating everything because of his midlife crisis. But Victoria's lies convinced no one who knew Richard and his upstanding character. People began to question her version of events, especially when Mrs. Eleanor discreetly confirmed the truth to a few people close to the family. Victoria's gradual social isolation was a natural consequence of her actions becoming public. People she had always considered friends began to see her in a different light, wondering if she had treated other employees just as cruelly. During this period, something unexpected happened. Daniel, Martha's son, won a scholarship to study business administration at a private university. The news came just as Martha was beginning to believe that her life could really change. "Mom," said Daniel when she arrived home that night, "you won't believe what happened." "What is it, my son?" "I got the scholarship. I'm going to be able to study business administration." Martha's joy was indescribable. After years of struggling to pay for her son's medical treatment and worrying about his future, she finally saw a light at the end of the tunnel. "How did you manage it?" she asked, still processing the news. "A teacher at school recommended me for a scholarship program for low-income students with good grades," Daniel explained, "and apparently Mr. Richard gave a very strong reference for our family." The discovery that Richard had discreetly helped with the reference touched Martha deeply. Even in the midst of his own family troubles, he had found the time to help her son. "Mom," Daniel continued, "I know you've sacrificed so much for me over the years. Now it's my turn to make you proud." The embrace between mother and son was filled with emotion and hope. For the first time in a long while, Martha felt that the future held good things in store for her family. The next day, she sought out Richard at Sterling Financial Solutions to thank him for the reference. "Mr. Richard," she said, "Daniel told me about the letter of recommendation. Thank you so much." "It was my pleasure," Richard replied. "Daniel is a smart, determined young man. He deserves every opportunity he can get." "You've already done so much for us," said Martha, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "The best repayment is seeing you thrive," Richard said sincerely. "That's what makes me happy." Richard's genuine generosity stood in stark contrast to the pettiness Martha had experienced with Victoria. It was as if she had spent years in a dark world and had finally discovered that light and kindness were within her reach. Meanwhile, Richard and Victoria's divorce proceedings continued to move forward. Victoria's attempts to secure a hefty alimony were complicated when evidence of her abusive behavior was presented in court. She treated employees as if they were inferior beings, Mrs. Eleanor testified during a hearing, "and it happened right in front of my granddaughter." Mrs. Eleanor's testimony, coming from a respected woman in the community, carried significant weight in the case. The judge began to question Victoria's fitness for joint custody of Chloe. "A child deserves to grow up in an environment where she learns the values of respect and compassion," the magistrate observed during one of the sessions. Victoria realized she was losing not just her husband, but potentially regular access to her daughter as well. The reality of the consequences of her years of cruelty was finally coming into full view. Desperate, she made one last attempt to regain some control over the situation. She sought out Martha at Sterling Financial Solutions, where she worked, hoping to convince her to testify in her favor. "Martha," she said, when she found her former employee organizing files, "I need to talk to you." Martha was surprised to see Victoria at her workplace, but she kept her professional composure. "Yes, Mrs. Victoria?" "You know I've always treated you well, right?" Victoria began with an outright lie. "Sometimes I was stressed, but it was never anything personal against you." The attempt to rewrite history left Martha stunned. "Mrs. Victoria," she said calmly, "that's not how I remember things. But you understand that sometimes people exaggerate small situations, right?" Victoria insisted. "Richard is making it seem like I was a terrible person." "I can't talk about that," Martha responded diplomatically. "That's a matter between the two of you." Martha's refusal to engage in Victoria's manipulation left the woman even more desperate. "If you testify that I was never cruel to you, I can help financially with your son's education," Victoria offered, trying her last card of bribery. The bribery offer was the last straw for Martha. After years of enduring humiliations, she finally found her voice. "Mrs. Victoria," she said firmly, I'm not going to lie to anyone, and I don't need your help for anything." Martha's direct and dignified response symbolically marked her complete transformation. The woman who once accepted humiliations in silence now refused to be corrupted or manipulated. "You'll regret this," Victoria threatened, completely losing her composure. "The only thing I regret," Martha replied, "is having accepted being treated badly for so long." With those words, Martha walked away, leaving Victoria alone with her anger and despair. Richard, who had witnessed the end of the conversation without being noticed, felt proud of the courage Martha had shown. Her transformation from victim to empowered person was one of the most rewarding aspects of that entire difficult situation. "Martha," he said, approaching after Victoria left, "you did very well." "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but I learned that sometimes we have to defend our dignity." "Exactly," Richard agreed, "and you defended yours with great class." The divorce process came to an end a few weeks later. Richard obtained primary custody of Chloe, with supervised visits for Victoria, until she demonstrated genuine changes in her behavior. The financial settlement was fair, but not generous, considering the circumstances that led to the divorce. Victoria moved to a smaller apartment and had to face the reality of her deteriorated social situation. Many of her old friends avoided her, and she began to realize how she had destroyed relationships through years of arrogant and cruel behavior. Meanwhile, Martha's life continued to improve in every aspect. Her performance at the office was excellent, and Richard had begun considering promoting her to roles of greater responsibility. "Martha," he said during a monthly review meeting, "I'd like to offer you a promotion to administrative supervisor." "Supervisor?" she asked, surprised. "You've demonstrated exceptional organizational and leadership skills," Richard explained, "and the whole team enjoys working with you." The promotion represented not only a significant salary increase, but also professional recognition that Martha had never dreamed of achieving. "I accept," she said, with a radiant smile. The complete transformation of her professional life was almost surreal. In a few months, she had gone from a humiliated housekeeper to a respected supervisor at a thriving company. Daniel was also thriving in his university studies. His excellent grades and dedication impressed professors and classmates. During the holidays, he began working part-time at Richard's office, learning about business administration hands-on. "Your mother is a very special person," Richard said to Daniel during one of their conversations. "She faced very difficult situations with admirable dignity." "I always knew she was strong," Daniel replied, "but now I understand better everything she went through to give me better opportunities." The bond between mother and son grew even stronger as both built more promising futures. Martha felt proud of the man Daniel was becoming, and he admired the courage she had shown to transform her life. Chloe, for her part, was adapting well to the new family dynamic. With less tension at home and more quality time with her father, she became a happier and more confident child. "Daddy," she said during one of her visits to the office, "you and Auntie Martha are the best." The child's joy at seeing the people she loved thriving was contagious. Richard realized that his decision to prioritize moral values over social convenience had resulted in a much healthier environment for his daughter. Mrs. Eleanor, who had catalyzed many of the positive changes through her intervention, observed the entire transformation with deep satisfaction. "You made the right decisions," she told Richard during one of their conversations, "and look how much better everyone is now." "Including me," Richard admitted. "Living with constant tension and dishonesty was consuming me. Now I feel like I can truly be myself." The emotional honesty Richard had achieved was reflected in every aspect of his life. He was a more present father, a fairer boss, and a more upright person. A year after the beginning of that whole transformation, Richard organized a small party at the office to celebrate Martha's work anniversary. The whole team participated, and Chloe was there with a special drawing she had made for her Auntie Martha. "This drawing is for you," Chloe said, handing the colorful paper to Martha. "It's you in your office being important." The drawing showed a smiling female figure behind a desk with the word supervisor written in big, colorful letters. Martha held the drawing against her chest remembering how it had all started with other drawings on a wall and how her life had completely changed since then. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, hugging Chloe. "This is the best gift I could ever receive." During the party, Richard made a special toast. "To Martha," he said, raising his glass, "a woman who taught us that dignity and competence don't depend on title or social standing, but rather on character and determination." The team's applause echoed through the office as Martha was moved by the recognition. "And to Richard," she replied, raising her own glass, "a man who proved that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it." The joint toast symbolized not just a professional friendship, but a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. Meanwhile, Victoria watched from afar the success of all the people she had tried to diminish. Her past attempts to humiliate Martha had resulted in the opposite. The housekeeper she despised now enjoyed respect and prosperity that she herself had lost. The irony of the situation was not lost on Victoria. Her cruelty had destroyed her own life while propelling those she had tried to hurt. Alone in her small apartment, she began to reflect on the choices that had led her to that situation. For the first time in her life, she was forced to confront the truth about her own character and about the consequences of her actions. The loneliness and social isolation she experienced were the direct result of years of treating other people as inferior. Now, with no power or status to hide behind, she was discovering what it was like to be vulnerable and despised. "Perhaps," she thought in a rare moment of self-awareness, "I should have learned from Martha instead of trying to destroy her." But that realization came too late to save her former life. The bridges she had burned with her cruelty could not be easily rebuilt. 2 years after the start of the entire transformation, Martha had fully settled into her new life. She had bought her own house in a better neighborhood, Daniel was graduating with honors from university, and she had developed a social circle of colleagues who respected and admired her. "Auntie Martha," said Chloe during one of her visits, "you're the nicest person I know." "Thank you, Princess," replied Martha, embracing the girl who had become like a daughter to her. "You're very special to me, too." Their bond had remained strong through all the changes, proving that genuine affection transcends superficial circumstances. Richard, watching the interaction between his daughter and Martha, reflected on how that situation had taught valuable lessons to his entire family. "Chloe is learning important values by seeing how you bounced back from difficult situations," he commented to Martha. "I hope she learns that it's never acceptable to treat someone badly, regardless of social standing," replied Martha. "She already has," Richard assured her. "She always stands up for classmates who are mistreated at school. You've been a powerful role model for her." The positive influence Martha had on Chloe represented a triumph over all the cruelty she had faced. Instead of allowing the humiliations to make her bitter, she had used her experiences to teach compassion and fairness. Daniel, now graduated and working at a respectable company, often expressed gratitude for the mother who had sacrificed so much for him. "Mom," he said during a family dinner, "you'll always be my hero. I don't know how you managed to keep your dignity in such difficult situations." "I managed because I had you to give me strength," replied Martha, "and because I learned that our self-worth can't depend on how other people treat us." The wisdom Martha had gained through her experiences turned her into a source of advice and support for others in similar situations. She began volunteering with organizations that helped working women learn about their rights and build self-esteem. "Your story inspires people," Richard said when he learned about her volunteer work. "You're turning pain into purpose." "It's the only way to make sense of everything I went through," explained Martha. "If I can help other women not to accept humiliation, then it was all worth it." The multiplying impact of her personal transformation was creating positive ripples that spread far beyond her individual life. During an afternoon at the office, 3 years after that first traumatic day with the drawings on the wall, Martha received an unexpected visit. Victoria showed up, visibly humbler and wearier than before. "Martha," she said hesitantly, "can I talk to you for a few minutes?" Martha received her professionally but with caution. "Of course, Mrs. Victoria." "I came here to apologize," said Victoria, the words coming out with difficulty. For real this time. For years of mistreatment, for the cruelty, for everything. The sincerity in Victoria's tone was different from her previous apologies. Martha could tell this one came from a place of genuine recognition rather than manipulation. "I lost everything because of my behavior," Victoria continued. "My marriage, my friends, my daughter's respect, and I deserve all of it." "Mrs. Victoria," said Martha gently, "I appreciate your apology, and I hope you've found peace." "I'm still looking," Victoria admitted, "but I wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused, and that I deeply regret it." The apology, though belated, represented the closure Martha didn't know she needed. Seeing Victoria humiliated and remorseful brought more sadness than satisfaction, because it demonstrated the human cost of cruelty. "We can all change and grow," Martha said diplomatically. "I hope you find your way." After Victoria left, Richard appeared at Martha's office door. "I saw you had an interesting visitor," he remarked. "She came to apologize," Martha explained, "and she seemed sincere this time. How do you feel?" "Sad for her," Martha admitted. "No one deserves to live with so much regret and loneliness." The compassion Martha showed even towards someone who had mistreated her revealed the depth of her personal transformation. She had developed the emotional maturity to separate people from their actions and to choose forgiveness over resentment. "You're a remarkable person," Richard said with admiration. "I don't know if I'd be capable of such generosity." "Anger only hurts the person who carries it," Martha replied. "I'd rather use my energy to build good things." This life philosophy had become the foundation of every decision Martha made, allowing her to keep growing and thriving instead of staying stuck in the past. As the years went by, the story of Martha's transformation became legendary among office staff and family acquaintances. She was living proof that personal dignity and perseverance could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Chloe, now a teenager, often brought friends to meet Auntie Martha, proudly telling them how she had overcome hardships to become a successful person. "Auntie Martha taught me that we should always treat everyone with respect," Chloe explained to her friends, "no matter what their job is or how much money they have." The lesson had taken deep root in Chloe's moral upbringing, creating a new generation of people committed to equality and compassion. Daniel, established in his career and in a serious relationship, was planning to get married and give Martha grandchildren. He often credited his work ethic and moral values to the example his mother had set. "Mom," he said during an intimate conversation, "when I have children, I want to raise them with the same values you taught me: honest work, personal dignity, and compassion for everyone." "Those are the only values that truly matter," Martha agreed. "Everything else is temporary." The wisdom she had gained through her experiences had made her a respected matriarch, not only in her own family, but in the broader community. On a special afternoon, 5 years after that first traumatic day, Richard organized a small ceremony at the office to formalize Martha's promotion to administrative manager. The position came with a substantial salary and significant responsibilities. "Martha Higgins," Richard said during the ceremony, "you exemplify the very best of human nature. Your journey from humiliated housekeeper to respected manager is an inspiration to us all." The applause from the assembled staff echoed through the office as Martha received her new nameplate and office keys. "Thank you," she said, visibly moved, "not just for the professional opportunity, but for helping me discover my own worth." The ceremony represented much more than a corporate promotion. It was the official recognition of a complete personal transformation, from victim to leader, from humiliated to respected. Mrs. Eleanor, now nearly 80 but still sharp and active, was present at the ceremony. "Martha, dear," she said afterward, "you were always special. You just needed a chance to shine." "You changed my life by standing up for me," Martha replied. "I'll never forget your courage." "You're the one who had courage," Mrs. Eleanor corrected. "I only pointed out what everyone should have seen from the start." The conversation between the two women, separated by age and social class but united by mutual respect, symbolized the triumph of human values over superficial prejudice. That night, Martha went back home, her own home bought with her own work, and reflected on the incredible journey she had traveled. 5 years earlier, She had been on her knees, scrubbing drawings off a wall, while being humiliated by a cruel woman. Now she managed a team of 12 people at a thriving company, was respected in her community, and had raised a son who had become a man of integrity. It all started when I decided I deserved to be treated with dignity, she thought, remembering the exact moment she found the courage to stand up to Victoria's cruelty. That seemingly small decision had set off a chain of events that transformed not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Daniel came home that night with flowers to celebrate his mother's promotion. "For the best office manager in the city," he said, handing her the bouquet. "And for the best son in the world," she replied, embracing him. The love between mother and son, strengthened by years of shared struggle, had become the solid foundation on which both had built their successful lives. As they prepared dinner together, Martha thought of all the people who had contributed to her transformation. Richard, who had defended her dignity when she couldn't defend it herself. Mrs. Eleanor, who had insisted on the truth when others tried to hide it. Chloe, who had shown that genuine affection doesn't recognize social hierarchies. Even Victoria, indirectly, had contributed to her journey. The cruelty she had experienced had forced her to find reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, and to develop a compassion that made her a better person. "Mum," said Daniel as they cooked, "do you think everything happened the way it was supposed to?" "I think everything happened the way it needed to happen," she replied thoughtfully. "Sometimes we have to go through the darkness to truly appreciate the light." The wisdom in her words reflected years of reflection and personal growth. Martha had learned to turn trauma into strength, humiliation into humility, and suffering into compassion. As they dined in her own dining room, in her own home surrounded by photos of happy moments and professional achievements, Martha felt a deep peace. Her journey had proven that human dignity is inalienable, that character overcomes circumstance, and that perseverance combined with solid values can overcome any adversity. Across the city, Victoria was alone in her small apartment, reflecting on the choices that had led her to that loneliness. She had started therapy and volunteer work, trying to rebuild not just her life but her fundamental character. "Maybe it's never too late to change," she thought, looking at an old photo of Chloe. "Maybe I can still become the person I should have been from the start." Her journey of redemption would be much harder than Martha's rise, because it takes more courage to confess your mistakes than to overcome them. But perhaps with time and sincerity, she could find some measure of peace and recover at least part of her relationship with her daughter. Richard, Chloe, and Mrs. Eleanor were having dinner together at their home, now a much more harmonious household than it had been years before. "Dad," said Chloe, "do you think Auntie Martha is coming to my birthday next month?" "Of course she is," Richard assured her. "She would never miss your birthday. She's really like family, isn't she?" "Exactly," Richard agreed, "and it always will be." Martha Higgins's complete integration into the family's life, not as a servant, but as a beloved and respected person, represented the final victory of human values over social prejudice. Mrs. Eleanor smiled as she listened to the conversation. Her intervention years earlier had set off changes that continued to yield positive results. She felt proud not only of the son she had raised, but of the courage she had shown in confronting injustice when she saw it. Good people always find each other, she thought, and cruel people end up alone with their cruelty. The wisdom of her 80 years had been confirmed once more in the story of Martha and her family. The end. Now tell us what you thought of this story of triumph and dignity. Do you know someone who has been through similar situations? Do you believe Martha made the right decisions along her journey? Your opinion is very important to us. Leave a comment, leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories about people who transformed their lives through courage and perseverance.